Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're looking at a really fascinating question. We're going to dive into centuries of history to see how a nation's borders were forged, creating one of the most recognizable shapes on the whole world map.
All right, so let's get right into it. You see a map of Vietnam, and you know it instantly, right? But how did it get that long, iconic S shape? Well, the answer isn't in geology. Nope, it's a thousand-year story. A story of relentless expansion, some really deep divisions, and, finally, unification.
And to really get this journey, we've got to go way back. I mean, all the way to the beginning, to the cradle of Vietnamese civilization. We're talking long before that S shape we all know even started to take form.
So here's the thing. The story doesn't start with a long country at all. It starts with a small, pretty compact state called Văn Lang. This place, established by the legendary Hung kings, was the first true state in Vietnamese history. Think of it as the seed, the core from which everything else was going to grow.
And what's really incredible is just how small this starting point actually was. The entire nation, it was all packed into the fertile deltas of what we now call northern and north-central Vietnam. That's it. This was the original heartland.
Okay, so from that small northern core, something huge begins to happen. One of the most significant, most persistent movements in all of Southeast Asian history kicks off, a relentless, centuries-long push to the south.
Now, this wasn't a one-and-done kind of thing, not at all. It was a whole series of major expansions driven by powerful dynasties over hundreds and hundreds of years. And this march to the south, it was mostly at the expense of their neighbors, the Champa Kingdom. They took it piece by piece, century by century.
You can really see how this was a step-by-step process. It's like you can watch the country literally stretching down the coastline. With every single push by a new dynasty, the territory of Dai Viet, that's what it was called back then, it just got longer and thinner.
But then, history does what it does best. It throws a massive curveball. The nation actually fractures. It falls into a civil war. And yet, and this is the paradox, its territory kept growing, but in a totally surprising new direction.
Think about this. For almost 100 years, Vietnam wasn't one country. It was two. The nation was officially split, pitting the Trent lords up in the north against the Nguyen lords down in the south, and this created a really bitter, long-drawn-out stalemate.
So here's the crucial point. This division created two totally different game plans. The north, they were focused on their own internal power struggles. But the south, well, they were blocked from going north by the Trent, so they had nowhere else to go but, you guessed it, further south, right into the huge, fertile Mekong Delta.
And you know what? The Nguyen lords were unbelievably successful at this. They absorbed what was left of the Champa Kingdom and just kept pushing, deep into what was then Khmer territory in the Mekong Delta. On top of that, they started establishing Vietnam's presence out in the South China Sea, taking control of those key island chains.
So, after centuries of this wild story, this parallel track of division and expansion, all the pieces were finally brought together. And they were brought together by the very same family, the same clan that had pushed so far south in the first place.
It was a descendant of those southern lords, a guy named Nguyen Ang, who finally defeated all his rivals, and that includes the massive Tay Son Rebellion. He goes on to establish the Nguyen dynasty, and in 1802, for the first time since the 1500s, he ruled over a unified territory, all the way from the northern border to the southern tip.
And get this, for a little while, the country's territory was actually bigger than it is today. Under Emperor Gia Long's successor, Minh Mong, Vietnam pushed west, and for a short time, it even incorporated Cambodia, reaching the absolute biggest it had ever been in its history.
But the final borders, those clean lines we see on a map today, well, they weren't drawn by Vietnamese emperors. Nope, they were drawn by a brand new power on the scene, a colonial power arriving from Europe.
Yeah, the French colonization completely changed the map. After they took control, they created what they called the Indo-Chinese Union, and they started adjusting the borders with the neighbors, giving up some land to China, but also gaining some territory up in the northwest. They were the ones who carved out the final shape that we all recognize today.
Of course, the 20th century brought one last really painful division right at the 17th parallel, which happened after the war with the French. It actually wasn't until 1975 that the country was fully reunified, finally cementing the territory that had been forged over that entire last 1,000 years.
So, after all that, let's put this in perspective. What's the scale of this incredible journey?
Well, the territory of Vietnam today is more than 3 times larger than its original core back in the Red River Delta. I mean, it tripled in size, all driven by 1,000 years of constant pressure to the south.
So the big takeaway here is this. Vietnam's S shape is not some accident of geography. Not at all. It's basically a map of a story. It's the result of a very deliberate, relentless, and, let's be honest, often brutal process. A process of human endeavor, of conquest, and of settlement, all played out over 1,000 years.
And all this leaves us with one last big question to think about. If the physical map was shaped by this history, then how is the nation's cultural map shaped by it too? You know, its food, its different dialects, its very identity. How is all of that shaped by this incredible 1,000-year journey from north to